Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to Concordia University's Fourth Space. Thank you for joining us for today's event. It's both a discussion and a book launch for Reading the Room, Lessons on Pedagogy and Curriculum from the Gender and Sexuality Studies Classroom. And just to help situate you, we are streaming to YouTube, live from Fourth Space, and we are located here on unceded Indigenous lands in Tiohtià:ke, Montreal. Here at Fourth Space, we work with our university community to help mobilize knowledge by co-creating daily activities that examine research questions and projects in development across the university. We're also running today's event as a live stream Zoom meeting, so those of you joining us there, if you have any comments or questions, just pop those into the chat. We can read those out a little bit later on. And also for those of you joining us here in the space, if you just raise your hand, we'll bring a microphone over to you during a question and answer period. With that, it's very much my pleasure to hand things over to the Director and Acquisitions Editor of the Concordia University Press, Ryan Van Housty. Ryan, over to you.
Thank you, Douglas, and thanks as always to everyone at Fourth Space for being such great hosts and event collaborators. Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today, whether it's in person here at Fourth Space or if you are joining us online. We are here today to both celebrate the release and also discuss the contents of Reading the Room, Lessons on Pedagogy and Curriculum from the Gender and Sexuality Studies Classroom, edited by Natalie Kouri-Towe, who will also be moderating a panel discussion with contributors to the volume. For those of us that are here in person, if you haven't had a chance, we have refreshments at the back, and don't be shy. Please grab a snack or a warm beverage and fortify yourself against this February weather. All of us at Concordia University Press have been thrilled to work with Natalie Kouri-Towe on bringing this frank and candid collection to publication. This book brings together reflections by professors and students about their experiences addressing sensitive issues that come up in the classroom. The idea behind this volume was to encourage people to share the conversations they would normally only have with colleagues in private, and to do so now in a more public forum. So topics in this volume include debates about things like cancel culture, trigger warnings, student expectations, the sometimes difficult place of humor in the classroom, finding ways to decolonize syllabi, as well as what it is like to be perceived as embodying a topic that one teaches. What happens when something goes wrong? How can we find ways to address conflict? How can the classroom create a coalitional approach to education? Now, this all sounds very serious, and it is, but I assure you that there's also lots of refreshingly queer fun and care throughout the book. Gender and sexuality studies have long been at the forefront of discussions about gender, sexuality, race, class, regional disparities, and other asymmetrical power relations. Other fields of study and the public at large stand to benefit from these experts' efforts to teach difficult subject matters and make the classroom a place that can address conflict, disagreement, and difference. I think this book comes out at the right time, despite gender and sexuality studies continuing to be targeted by those looking to score cheap political points in denigrating marginalized groups. Scholars in this field, through generous efforts like this volume, will continue to offer correctives to outdated and inaccurate characterizations of human life. A highly reactive contemporary discourse has left many people worried about saying the wrong thing, but we can't let that mean that no one says anything. We are grateful to Natalie Kouri-Towe and to all of the contributors for being open about their classroom experiences in the hopes that this can assist other instructors and students in a broad range of settings. I must shamelessly say that we have books for sale at the back we're offering the print edition for a nice incentivized discount, very affordable. And buying the print edition helps to support Concordia University Press's open access publishing program, where we release all of our books for free on our Manifold platform, which is hosted by the Concordia University Library, and its URL is press.library.concordia.ca. I just wanted to briefly show you what this looks like. This is our landing page for that site. And if you just scroll down, you'll see all of our books. Ooh, is it scrolling there, Doug? Oh yeah, you're gonna go for it? You wanna just roll down over to Reading the Room? It's towards the bottom. And so if you go to Reading the Room, there on the left, you click on it, you can say just start reading, or you can just scroll down a little bit there, Jax, and just click on a chapter title, like say chapter 3. And you'll notice there's some additional accessibility features. If you go up to the top right there, see that AA box? Yeah, click on that. And you can change the font to a sans serif, or if it's, that maybe it's just easier for you to read that way, you can adjust the font size, you can change the background color. These are all accessibility features just to help make this more legible, and these kinds of works are also in this EPUB 3 format, more compatible with reading on a mobile device, and they're also more compatible with text-to-speech readers for those with visual impairments. So please feel free to check out all of our books on our Manifold platform. Again, that's press.library.concordia.ca. I'm going to turn to the bios of our participants today. Natalie Kouri-Towe here to my right. She, her, is an associate professor of feminism and sexuality at the Simone de Beauvoir Institute here at Concordia University. We'll be kind of reading the room on Zoom today. I'm sorry that our panelists have been feeling rather under the already lousy weather. So I thank you even more for still joining us online today. We have on the top right of the screen, you'll see Nathalie Batraville, she, her, is an associate professor of queer theory and black feminisms at the Simone de Beauvoir Institute at Concordia University. Kimberley Manning, now top left there, she, her, is a professor of political science and the principal of the Simone de Beauvoir Institute at Concordia University. And last but not least, we have Alexis Poirier-Saumure joining us. He, him, is a PhD candidate and lecturer in the Department of Communication Studies at Concordia University. I really look forward to our discussion today, but first, please join me in a round of applause to congratulate Natalie Kouri-Towe and all the contributors on the publication of this book, and thank them for sharing their experiences with us. Take it away, Natalie.
Thank you, Ryan. Well, I have to start off by, first of all, thanking Fourth Space for this invitation to be able to use this incredible space on campus to launch the book and have an engaged panel with some of our contributors. We had hoped that we could do this in person fully because our contributors are mostly based here at Concordia, but unfortunately, that wasn't possible today, but it's really wonderful that the hybrid technology allows for easy integration and is a real testament to the wonderful things that are happening at our university right now. And I also really have to thank Ryan, who has been an incredible champion for this book. And really, I have to say that this book probably wouldn't exist if it hadn't been for Ryan's enthusiasm, encouragement, and support throughout the process of developing the book idea to working on drafts of the book, to editing the book itself, and all the way through production, and now getting to celebrate it. So thank you so much, Ryan. You are a very, very incredible acquisitions editor.
Oh, thank you.
And anyone would be lucky to.
I didn't write it.
And I also have to acknowledge and thank the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada and the Federation of Humanities and Social Sciences for their financial support for the development and production costs for this project. This project started, I guess, about 5 years ago in 2020 when Ryan and I had a conversation, and the seed was planted for coming up with an edited collection or some kind of collaboration around thinking about the classroom and thinking about gender and sexuality studies as a field and what we do in our classrooms. And I applied for a grant to bring together a group of researchers and scholars from across Canada over Zoom in the heart of the pandemic in 2021 to think together about some of the challenges that we were facing in relation to the classroom and education more broadly. And we had a subsequent meeting later that year in 2021, where we workshopped drafts of the papers that we had kind of developed through our conversations in that first January meeting. And so throughout that process, and then in the years since, this book has come about through, I think, the deepest form of collaboration that you can develop with a group of 28 people remotely. And so I really am so grateful to the contributors of this book who not only worked on their own chapters, but also gave feedback to their peers. And so you'll really hear throughout the book and feel throughout the book a sense of conversation across the contributors. And that was really intentional on the part of the people who participated in this process, not only because I think we were all very dedicated to the work of thinking collaboratively about the classroom and about education, but also because we wanted this book to be something that would speak to people outside of our own fields. And so this book was really written with a general reader in mind, anybody from any discipline who could come into the texts and find a place to start a conversation in dialogue with us. So the current political context that we're in, as Ryan mentioned, is pretty terrifying. And as people are grappling with and reeling from not only the political changes that are happening within Canada in provinces like Saskatchewan, Alberta, and New Brunswick that have introduced new legislation that aims to restrict or attack education sector and healthcare sector to reduce access to resources and supports to trans people, to women, and to non-binary people, and access to information and knowledge about sex education. In the United States, we're also seeing the intensification of these attacks and the potential promise for more to come here in Canada. So words like gender inclusion, equity, diversity, inclusion, or EDI, scientific and scholarly knowledge, all of these areas or topics are currently under either public or political debate or direct attack, depending on the context that we're looking at. And this book, I want to say, is an invitation to insist that the only way that we can address the circumstances that we're in is to approach these concerns and considerations both of reflexive framework and in collaboration. And that not just the classroom itself, but also in our approach to thinking about the role of education in society requires a coalitional approach. And this is the conclusion of the book that I wrote, which is to think about the classroom as a coalitional space. And I really think that the hope and promise of education is for there to be the possibility for that kind of transformative work. I'll just read a little bit from the introduction to say that taken together, the chapters throughout this collection ask us as teachers to resist the desire to control the outcome of learning while simultaneously putting into practice different strategies for making the classroom a better space, a space that develops critical skills in our students, a space that is more inclusive and welcoming of both teachers and students' differences, a space that holds the potential for experimenting with ideas and ways of envisioning the world differently, and a space that can hold the discomforts and resistance to learning and unlearning. So with that, I want to invite my three panelists, who are three contributors to the book, to share more about what they've written inside and to start a conversation together, the four of us. And then I would really love to open up that conversation to those who are here today in the room and those who have joined us online. So my first question is to ask the contributors to talk about your approach to teaching and how this connects to what you focused on in your chapter to Reading the Room. And maybe if you want to just remind us, or I can remind people of what your chapter was, we can do that. Maybe I'll just read your chapter titles out loud before I forget. So Kimberley and Manning co-authored a chapter with two former students, Mitchell Ray Yang and Rebecca Gael Joaquim. And the chapter is called The Classroom as a quote-unquote safe space for anti-racism work, Reflections on Racism in the Canadian Classroom and the Role of Students and Teachers. And then we have Nathalie Batraville, who has written a chapter called Kink in Pedagogy, A Case for Peer Teaching. And we have Alexis Poirier-Saumure, whose title is here, The First Teaching Experience, Failure as a Strategy for Critical, Anti-Oppressive, and Queer Approaches to Pedagogy. So maybe I'll invite Kim, do you want to get us started with this question about what your chapter focused on and what this means for your approach to teaching?
Yeah, thank you, everybody. And thank you especially, Natalie. I think in, my years of experience working with editors, you are by far the most attentive and careful of editors I've worked with, and really constructive and hands-on in terms of providing feedback. And I just want to thank you for your dedication to this project, and to really making it into a whole, because that doesn't often happen with edited volumes either. So just to give a big shout out to your stewardship, has been really, really instrumental. And I'd also just start by saying too that the reflections I'm going to share with you, fairly briefly. I feel like the kernel of what I'm going to share with you has really rested in the work I have had to do. I mean, Natalie talks about learning and unlearning, and that is as much the case for me as a professor as I think it's been for my students. And I came to the particular course in conversation with two former students who had enrolled in a kind of social action research class that we called the Feminist University. And they had enrolled in a 2018-2019 iteration. It was a full year course, and I was team teaching it with a colleague, Karen Herland, fantastic educator, from whom I continue to learn much of what I know today about teaching as well. And the course, really at its heart, the kind of intention, or if you will, the inspiration behind it really came out of Living a Feminist Life, Sarah Ahmed's book, which was published in 2017. And really was shaped by the commitment to, or the idea that through the effort to transform institutions, that we generate knowledge about them. And in this course in particular, students were resourced as best we could to tackle different equity projects within the institution itself. And one of the big issues that was really beginning to pick up steam at the time of this course in 2018-2019 was that of the, as of then, unyet publicly recognized trauma and catastrophe of the subjugation of the Black student movement in 1969 at Concordia University, advocating for accountability with respect to their classroom and learning experience, that time called Sir George Williams, and was subsequently came to be known as the Sir George Williams Affair. Students protesting for a number of weeks to realize better learning conditions and to remove the racism that they had been experiencing as students. So just to say quickly that the students took on a project in relationship to that work. But the chapter is less about the work that the students ended up taking in that context, and more about the ways in which, through my own teaching, I set up conditions in which power, and particularly the way in which racism continues to inform the classroom, the way in which I helped to set up a situation in which that went unacknowledged and unaddressed. And so while I was, in a sense, trying to galvanize students into undertaking equity projects, it was at the same time minimizing, or at least not providing attention to the kinds of racism at work in my own classroom. And by that, what I mean is not being attentive to the ways in which power was shaping how students could show up and participate in the work as it was taking shape. And this wasn't evident to me in the class itself and did not become evident to me until the actual work of writing the chapter with the students, where I think, in the best way that critical autoethnographic work, collective critical autoethnographic work can do is really come to understand a lived shared experience in a new way. And the students themselves were willing to, in a sense, show up in the work with me and to really dive down into what it meant to make that the center of and that being the ways in which I had actually reinforced rather than undid the systemic work of racism in the classroom. So I think I'll start there because I had 5 minutes and I'm just at time now. But we can come back to that and I can provide more commentary. But it was really, I'll just say, it was Mitchell and Rebecca's honesty and willingness to just say, no, these are the ways that that made it very difficult for us to learn in that context. And so much of the writing and the contributions of the piece really come through that very important critique. Thank you.
Natalie, do you want to go next?
Yes, thank you. I also want to echo Kim's gratitude for the work and the care and the patience that you had in helping us, supporting us as we wrote our pieces and collaborated and thought together to produce this volume together. And I actually also want to thank you for supporting me, for just being a great colleague in general. The class that provided the inspiration for this chapter is a class that I actually in part taught thanks to your encouragement. I was just kind of thinking about teaching a class on kink and BDSM, and the deadline had actually already passed, and you still encouraged me to go forth and teach that class. And I think that that's just really emblematic of the way that you are as a colleague, as a scholar, and the way that you help just make things possible, even when there seem like there are lots of constraints. And so I just, really am grateful that I have had the opportunity to work with you as a colleague, and also as to have you as my editor. So the contribution that I offered in this volume was around a methodology that I implemented in a few of my classes, but namely in a class on kink and BDSM that I started teaching at SDBI. And the methodology is around peer teaching or peer facilitation. And basically it involves students teaching collectively the majority, if not the near entirety of the classes for the semester. And so typically I teach the first 2 classes in addition to the introductory class as a way to model teaching, facilitating, providing creative activities, and then in groups of ideally 2, 3, or 4, or 3 or 4 is kind of the sweet spot. The students then teach the material to each other. And this methodology has had numerous advantages. One of them is that instead of being accountable to the teacher for doing the readings and showing up to class and showing up on time, they're actually accountable to each other. And it creates a kind of sense of solidarity and a sense of collaborative learning, wherein the students aren't just passive recipients of knowledge and information that's being shared by the instructor, but instead they're really working collaboratively, problem solving together in a much more egalitarian kind of way. The act itself of teaching material is one that also facilitates the integration of that knowledge. In order to teach something, you really have to organize the ideas, you have to integrate them, you have to anticipate questions, such that the kind of preparation that they have to do in order to teach is probably more in depth than what they would do to write a paper or to prepare for an exam. And then the third sort of benefit of this methodology, in my experience and what I've seen and found, is that often students can choose to teach a topic in the course that's closest to their own personal experience and actually closer to their experience than it would be mine. And so I've had maybe students who are trans, and so who teach one of the weeks that have to do with trans issues in a way often that is much more rich and much more relevant to their own experiences than if I was teaching. Obviously, the inverse can also happen. Students can also happen to teach something that is less aligned to their own experiences in a way that might make it more challenging for them. But in the instances where the students have actually chosen material that speaks to them personally, I find that everybody, including myself, really benefits from it. And then even the challenge of having to kind of, reach beyond what you know is also really rewarding and a really rich learning experience. And in terms of the kink class in particular, because thinking about BDSM is very much thinking about power exchange, thinking about play, there's a sense in which allowing the students to engage in a kind of play by being the instructor, being the teacher for a day, and also reversing the kind of power imbalance wherein the instructor has the power such that they are able to occupy that position, felt also relevant in the context of a class about BDSM. And then in the article, I also talked about the other classes, or I mean, I may not have mentioned the other classes that I've taught it in, but I also use this methodology in a class that I teach us also in women's studies and sexuality studies called Ending Sexual Violence. That's a class about prison abolition and anti-carceral responses to sexual violence. And in that class, that methodology or that sort of teaching technique, peer facilitation, has also felt really relevant because that class is about agency and also about power in a different way, but giving the students that agency in a sort of concrete way beyond merely conversations about agency being theoretical allows us to actually apply them. But it's a methodology that I've also found important to try to implement because it also addresses just the pressures of being a Black professor in a predominantly white institutions and the kinds of demands on the labor of Black faculty. And I've had the pleasure of talking about this methodology at different conferences and different contexts, and fellow Black faculty members are really curious and interested to hear about it because it does allow us to think creatively about questions around equity and diversity in a way that is much more concrete and actually potentially impacts the burden of labor that Black faculty members and other marginalized faculty members might feel. And so that's also an important aspect of the article, but maybe I can talk about that a little bit later.
Wonderful. Thank you, Natalie. And I'm glad that you brought up that this also, the topics that you're addressing in your chapter are not just about your own specific classroom, but strategies that people might be interested in using across different fields and disciplines, especially thinking about how we're positioned as teachers, and our subjectivity might mean that we need to think more creatively about how we come into the classroom and what we do with our pedagogical practices. I also wanted to mention that part of the project were a number of graduate students and undergraduate students, so as we mentioned before, and I want to invite Alexis to respond next, who is actually a graduate student here at Concordia presently.
Thank you. Thank you everyone for organizing this, for being here. Thank you, and Katie. I also echo what my contributors said about your amazing work. Yeah, I'm so grateful for you. My life in academia. So I wrote my chapter about the first teaching experience because I was so anxious about it and I needed an outlet. So this was a great outlet for this. It was really helpful to be able to think through the difficulties and the anxieties and the challenges that come up when you teach for the first time. And my first time teaching was also on Zoom, the winter of 2021, so peak pandemic. So that was a challenge as well. So I'm still speaking from the standpoint of someone who hasn't taught a lot, like I've taught again after this, but I'm still kind of in the early stages of my teaching career. And the class that I taught is a class called Media and Gender in the communication department. So it's a third-year class in gender and sexuality studies, basically, that students choose to take. And so my reflections potentially are more like maybe less relevant for intro courses or mandatory courses. I say that because, as a result, my kind of approach to teaching has more to do with political and pedagogical relations and maybe less with like educational strategies. So I was mainly concerned with basically pedagogical relations in the classroom. And so that's mostly what I talked about in my chapter. But yeah, basically, I would say that there are two elements in the chapter that I would say are really part of what I would call my approach to teaching. And they come directly from interactions that I've had with my students. So the first one is something that was really important for the students is to have a really dynamic and open relationship to how I situate myself in the classroom. So in the chapter, I talk about how I was told by students that they were sick of being taught critical theories of power and identity by white men, which I really agreed with, and I really expected to hear that. But it remains something that is really important for me to name and to offer the classroom. And not only in a kind of performative statement of my various entities as a white, queer, able-bodied settler man, but also an invitation to challenge me in relation to those aspects, and actually to all aspects of identity and position, and also in relation to the position that I occupy in the classroom as a teacher. And there's also something very kind of reassuring. If you feel anxious as an inexperienced instructor, there's something really reassuring about letting your classroom know that they can challenge you. For me, at least, it felt that way because I was so worried about not being knowledgeable enough, kind of in the fact that students often perceive their instructors as holders of all knowledge. And so telling them openly that I welcome their criticism and challenges kind of took that pressure off for me. And it also established a more humble approach to teaching, which is something of the highest importance for me in a critical theory class. So that was something that was talked about in the classroom, like what are the uses of situating oneself, but like in a more relational understanding of that term. And the second one that I talk about in the chapter is about allyship and coalition building, not only about the possibility for teaching as a concrete practice of allyship, which it can be maybe to a certain extent, but also about teaching students to be allies and co-conspirators themselves. And so obviously, I think that the current political climate calls for a university classroom that is more capable of helping students become more equipped at enacting community, at enacting solidarity, especially in terms of sexuality and gender. And so my approach to teaching in that regard is that what I value more basically for students to develop is such a capacity, and less the development of like analytical capacities that really don't feed action. And so one of the ways that this showed up in the classroom, for example, is I really insist on trying to find ways to collectively establish the objects of critiques that we wanted to deconstruct and look at together. And these discussions themselves can be a very good start, because these moments when we are trying to establish what we want to look at together are often sites actually for coalition building dynamics, because that's when people talk about what matters to them and why. And so in this way, they really kind of come together, in a different way, basically. And so, yeah, that's what I would say about my approach to teaching.
Thank you, Alexis. I think this leads us nicely into the next question I have, which is, what approaches do you hope that students and also colleagues, other faculty members from outside of gender and sexuality classrooms will engage with more in the coming years? Or put another way, what lessons do you think people outside of our disciplines should be taking into their own classes? And Alexis, why don't we start back with you, actually, if you're okay with that?
Sure. Well, I think just to tie it to what I just said, I think that, yeah, something that I hope can be seen in more and more classrooms is really this capacity to support students in enacting coalition, community, and solidarity. Yeah, I think we can all agree that it has already become increasingly important and will continue to do so. But I think also, I was thinking about this earlier, and I like right now I'm deep into thesis writing, so I'm not so much connected to teaching. So I've had to kind of like unearth a bit all of these reflections, because teaching is not my direct reality right now. But I think in many ways, one way that this can happen is through more kind of like interdisciplinary approaches. And I've been thinking about that recently a lot, because my own doctoral research that I'm currently writing up is about teaching sexuality education in high schools. And one of the most kind of salient conclusions that the teachers that I spoke with are coming to is that interdisciplinarity is really key in helping students ground in more concretely what they learn in the world in which they live. So, which is kind of a precondition for solidarity and coalition building. But I think interdisciplinarity is not always easy to establish. But I think it's definitely something that I'm hoping to see more and more across various classrooms. Yeah, because I mean, there are certain disciplinary contexts that can be very kind of closed off, and the ways that the methods are established, the ways that evaluations also are established, doesn't always encourage kind of interdisciplinary approaches, which can be very liberating. And I think, yeah, that would be a strategy to explore for various types of classrooms.
Great, thank you, Alexis. I really like the call to think interdisciplinarily around not only how we approach our own work and our research or our writing, but also for thinking that in relation to teaching. And I think there's so much that I've learned from people from other fields and disciplines. And I really like the idea of the path like that we take towards education being one in which we try and collaborate more or think alongside of people outside of our fields of specialization more and more in education. Natalie, do you want to go next?
Yeah, thank you. So thinking, I was going to maybe continue what I was starting to share around the, relevance of the methodology that I've developed. And I'm also thinking with, what Alexis shared earlier around allyship and being an ally to students. And for me, part of the work is also being an ally to yourself. Like how can we best support ourselves in trying to take care of ourselves, trying to have longevity in this career, or just longevity period in our lives. And so part of what I talk about in the chapter is I cite a Black feminist philosopher who, on her deathbed, told one of her students that academia killed her. And so part of what I wanted to do is to try to take that seriously. And since I began writing that article, shortly after Bell Hooks was obviously a well-renowned Black feminist scholar, died at the age of 69. And so, the manifold pressures on Black women in academia are more and more documented and visible, but I think depending on the institution, there aren't necessarily resources and structures in place to respond to that. And so often we have to create those ourselves. And so for me, peer facilitation was a way to try to respond to that And I think initially I was, somewhat shy to admit to students the partially self-serving dimension of the methodology. And I would focus on what are the very real benefits for the students themselves, for the classroom itself as a collaborative space. But I think they also appreciate the benefit to me. And I think that they also appreciate the labor that it still takes to hold the space that the students are facilitating together. And so I do feel like the methodology, peer facilitation, is something that can be applied to different disciplines. And it's also an invitation to think about power in the classroom more broadly, and also the process of learning. I talked about, as I mentioned, I talked about this methodology in a conference that I was attending several months ago. And one of my co-panelists was kind of taken aback by this approach and just said that, she felt she couldn't see herself relinquishing the control in the classroom. And my response was that we don't really have that much control. Like, the control is largely an illusion, because learning is such a personal, individual and collective experience, that the students will hear what they hear, they'll retain what they are able to retain. And there really isn't that much control over what their learning experience is. And I think obviously we can try to create a learning space and learning experience that is as generative as possible, that allows for as many possibilities for exchanging and learning and asking questions. But at the end of the day, especially in an advanced seminar, and I only use this methodology in an advanced seminar, the students are already coming equipped, capable of doing a lot of the learning themselves and having a lot of agency already over what they learn and how they learn it. And so I do feel like it's, I feel like the issue of equity is one that's central in what I try to share, and central in what I think other people can take away from this class. But then I've also become aware of the, that it's not necessarily for every classroom as well, right? Like, I'm not suggesting that everyone everywhere should necessarily apply this methodology. And I've taught some classes recently where I've decided to sort of take back the reins. But I still think that the sort of underlying issue of labor and extraction is one that that I'm interested in seeing how other people respond to as they engage with the work.
Great, thank you, Natalie. Kim, do you want to go next?
Sure. Yeah, thanks. And I'll speak just quickly as a political scientist, which is my home discipline and training. And I think so. It's gonna be a two-part response. So the piece itself that I wrote was really focused on the critique of my own teaching at a particular moment in time. And I'd like to just say that, building on also what Alexi was saying, that if, one of the things that I think is so critical is this grounding oneself in humility. And I think that I do see that among some of my colleagues in the discipline of political science, but I do think it's something, by the nature of our discipline, which is one very much focused on power and power over, rather than thinking through perhaps more, when those of us who are working through the framework of gender and sexuality and grassroots movements and community mobilizations, there's a very different conception, I think. I mean, still the critique of power, of course, but also thinking about other ways that power can be lived, and what that means, especially in community. So just to say that that piece around humility and not having all of the answers and never having had all of the answers, and that it is an illusion, really, actually, when I finally got that in the context of writing this piece, was a huge relief. Because for, whatever, the previous nearly 20 years of teaching, I'd been carrying around that idea that somehow I had to show up and had to know everything and had to control everything. And of course, that's as Natalie has said, an illusion. But the second thing I would say too is that, the very act of writing with my students, for me, was a part of learning how to renegotiate my own understanding of my relationship to the classroom. And in part through my colleagues, both Natalie's and my other colleagues at the SDBI, and in particular, again, a shout out to Karen Herland, I have really recrafted. So not only acknowledging for me the power relations in the classroom from the very get-go, and this is both in my political science classes as well as my gender studies classes, but also working through new ways of building, we call it community in my class, community of care, a praxis in which students are not only responsible in a sense for, or at times for teaching one another, but also for each other's learning. And by that, it's the pedagogical framework that I've adopted is one where we're all going to come in and work at creating an environment in which trust can be built over time, whether it's over many weeks or in the context of one course I teach, which is a week intensive. And that's a total reframe for me from how I was teaching 4 or 5 years ago. And again, I just want to emphasize that I'm doing this in for example, how I teach gender and politics in the People's Republic of China. It's based on this approach now, the senior seminar, of building a community of care and praxis, being aware of and attentive to the ways in which power shows up, and yet also being aware of how we can show up for each other in our own ongoing learning. And it's been transformative. And so, the writing itself led to the critique and then led to my really, really diving down and rethinking not only how do I teach in the gender studies classroom, but how do I teach political science?
Thank you, Kim. This conversation is really, it's both inspiring, but also it really reminds me of the legacy of what we bring into the classroom in higher education or post-secondary education. I mean, for people who are not on the professor side of things, what people are often shocked to discover is that most people who are professors in university or college have never been trained to be teachers. Sometimes people are lucky enough to take like a course with the Center for Teaching and Learning or have picked up skills here or there. But for the most part, we have adopted or absorbed a kind of a mentorship inherited model of how to teach, which is that we emulate the people who we took classes from. And maybe we try and become the kinds of teachers that we were most inspired by when we ourselves were students. And the reality is that it takes a lot more to actually figure out what to do in a classroom than to just mirror what was done to you. And I think teachers in all disciplines really face and struggle with the challenges that come up in their classrooms and largely feel really alone when they're trying to tackle those things. And when Ryan said that, this book is trying to bring people into conversation that happens normally behind closed doors, it really is the case. People normally in education talk to their trusted colleagues, their friends, people that they can turn to in confidence to ask, oh my God, this thing happened in the classroom. I think I messed up. I think something happened and I don't know how to recuperate from this. Or a student is really upset with me and I don't understand why. Or I feel really upset with my class right now and I don't know how to come back to the classroom without being angry and resentful. And all of those emotions and those experiences are shaping not just gender and sexuality studies classrooms, they're shaping classrooms across disciplines, in classrooms at all levels of education, even probably in high school and K-12, K-12 elementary and high school education, and educational contexts outside of institutions themselves. And I think that there's something about the power of talking through and collaborating with others to think through different ways and approaches for how to approach education or how to approach teaching and the practice of teaching that is really, really meaningful and important, especially given that one of the things that we've inherited, and this is something that I learned from Natalie's work, and in particular Natalie's work in this collection, and also just her work in general as a colleague, is, if we've inherited a model of education that centers coercion and punishment at the core, what does it mean for us to think differently about how we approach education through more generative, collaborative, and exploratory ways of engaging in learning? And so Natalie's method of peer teaching is like one example of how to practice that in a particular kind of classroom setting, but it's an orientation and an approach to education that I think is really meaningful and powerful right now. And I think that both Alexis and Kim's comments just now really speak to this, that when we come into conversation with our students and when we think about our relationship in the classroom is not one of power over, that like the teacher has to exert authority and gain control over the classroom, but one that's an invitation to be in dialogue, to work through, to think through, and to try and understand what students are coming into the classroom with and what we ourselves are bringing into the classroom, what we desire out of our classrooms, the better chances we have of being able to adapt to what emerges in an educational environment and setting. And there's this makes me think of actually one of the contributors in the book, Dina Georges, whose chapter looks at the concept of play and taking risks in the classroom. And one of the things that she does in the chapter is like think through this experience that she has where her students suddenly are behaving differently. Like they are resisting doing the readings, they don't want to like engage in the same way anymore. And she's like baffled by it and frustrated by it. And the conclusion she comes to is that you kind of have to let things relax enough that you give people room to be able to take risks in order to be able to re-engage in a space of learning when there's so much resistance or so much like discomfort or anxiety or other things that become blockages in the classroom. And I really take her insights to heart in thinking about what it means to not only think about pedagogy as what we teach in terms of the content of the classroom, but our orientation and approach towards how we deal with the classroom. And I think the idea of like softening when something hard happens is so antithetical to what we normally want to do in an educational environment. Like something hard happens and we want to like instantly like put the defenses on, put the walls up. And then another contributor, Dan Irving, talks about this also in his own relationship to his classroom, where he got also very frustrated when students didn't want to do the readings. This is like a common refrain, apparently, in education today. And one of the things that he reflected on in his chapter is, what does it mean to think about changing our way of coming into our relationships to both teaching and the classroom by hearing what others in the space want out of their learning environment as well. So with that, I want to maybe pose one more quick question before we open it to the floor for a Q&A and larger discussion, which is just given the fact that we have an environment right now that we've mentioned before that is filled with desires and expectations, but also a lot of anxiety and fear and a lot of backlash. Especially in the larger context in which geopolitical crises heighten the stakes of what we're learning in so many of our classes. How have you been navigating the relationship to your own teaching, and what are some things that you're thinking about as we navigate the current environment right now? And Alexis, I know you're not teaching right now at the moment, but perhaps if you want to just reflect on what it means to think about this, given the work that you're doing on secondary education in Quebec and sex education, which is one of the areas under fire in Canada at the moment. And maybe, Natalie, do you want to get us started?
Sure. I just also, before I answer the question, I wanted to sort of go back to, just underscore what you shared around the lack of training, formal or otherwise, to prepare us to become professors. And not only do we go from being students to then sort of emulating what we experienced as students as we're professors, but we also go from a context where as students we at least are repeatedly in repeatedly experiencing different pedagogical styles, different teachers, right? We're like in different classrooms. As we're graduate students, maybe we have the privilege of being a TA for different professors. And then once we're a professor, the only classroom we experience is our own. Like, I think there's also an isolation in not really attending classes anymore, unless you're like, taking, I don't know, like a sewing class or a painting class or something. Typically, you're not really going to be in a situation where you're exposed to how your colleagues teach, how people are teaching, and the more time goes on, I think the more that's unfortunate. And I was very lucky when Kim is still our chair, but when she was our chair a few years ago, offered to at least sit in on my class and like observe my teaching and give me feedback on my teaching, because I think it's really isolating. And I'm also curious. I feel like there's a part of me that I've been teaching now for 6 years and I haven't done it yet, but I would really love to like sit in on people's classes because I would like to know what it's like. But this at least is the closest thing, having this edited volume with people's experiences of teaching and classroom environments feels like the closest thing. But that's also, I think, like, I feel like my orientation, as both Kim and Alexis shared, is also towards humility. And another aspect of that sense of humility that I try to carry through my teaching is that I tend to have an orientation towards teaching topics that I actually don't master at all. Like my training is in literary studies, and I teach some courses that are more aligned with that. But the King class was one that I decided to teach really because it was a topic of ongoing interest. And this term, there's a class that I've taught several times that's on culture, and I've decided to teach it about Palestine and about the intersections of gender, decolonization, and Palestinian liberation, because it felt important in this moment. But once again, it's not an area of expertise of mine. But it feels really important. And for me, this is, I should say that this is one context where I'm not employing a peer teaching method. It does feel like it's more important for me to be the one that is sort of in the front of the class and doing most of the work, holding and facilitating the space. But as much as I think that anxieties are high and tensions are high, and also there's a lot of grief that different people are feeling in this time, I think that there's a sense of like the stakes having been raised as well. I think that people are like even hungrier for a space to answer really difficult questions, and specifically to answer questions to which like none of us have clear answers. And I think that many of us are like teaching about and are taught to teach about like what has already been published on and researched on, and to introduce students to a body of knowledge that exists that they may not be familiar with. But for me, it's important to try to use that as a starting point to answer questions for which we don't have answers. And so that's part of the work that I've already been doing in the class on ending sexual violence, where we look at prison abolition. But even that class, I felt like as time goes on and as ideas about prison abolition actually become more and more common, more and more accessible, I've actually felt like I've had to shift it. And so when I taught it last term, I had a shift towards thinking about the stakes of if prison abolition is a movement that, asks us to think about revolutionary change. For me, it was important to talk about armed resistance as part of conversations around revolutionary change. And so that felt like, a difficult and thorny and challenging question, but one that felt important, and that also put me back into the driver's seat as a teacher. But yeah, for me, I think that students are actually really like hungry for answering those questions, or having a space to think through questions for which we don't have answers, but that are actually really, really pressing, and often are matters of life and death. And so I think as much as possible, if we can try to answer that call, and then also, think about the specific sort of skills and measures that we can put in place so that that experience is as positive and generative as it can be for everybody.
Great, thank you, Natalie. It really makes me think a lot about what you've said about what happens when we avoid teaching or learning about something because we're afraid it's going to be too hard or too difficult or too challenging, like emotionally or politically. And I think the work that I've done in psychoanalysis of education has really illustrated that the more that we try and avoid something, the worse it becomes, the more difficult that becomes when we try and suppress it or we try and expel it in a way. And so what would it mean to think about the kind of work of the classroom as a space where we're willing to take risks, to engage with difficult and challenging conversations or topics, and hold space for the fact that there's going to be emotion in the classroom or emotion in a learning environment. I think it's one of the lessons that I've learned most from the scholarship in that area of literature in the psychoanalytic education literature that has been really powerful for my own approach to teaching. And I take it to heart, the work that you're doing, thinking about teaching material that you yourself don't feel like you have authority over or mastery over, but that you approach the process of teaching as one in which you're learning alongside your students and guiding that facilitated way of trying to answer questions that there might not be an easy answer for or any answer for in some moments. Kim and Alexis, do you have any final things that you'd like to maybe contribute to thinking about what you're taking with you as you navigate the pedagogical environment that we're in?
I think what I'll just say is just a shout out to our new colleague, Casey Burkholder at Concordia University, who does a lot of work around arts-based methodology. And this is has been with high school and elementary school students in the Maritimes around questions of gender and sexuality, and looking to find ways to engage students to find pathways towards thinking through about queer joy, right? And at the moment when things are feeling so hard in so many ways, I know that there is a way in which I think arts-based methodologies can do part of some of the things that we've been talking about, and that is can make other new kinds of coalition or allyship possible and visible in ways that may not happen through speaking or writing our papers, but that may take on this other form. And also just to say, Nathalie Batraville, I know you've been engaged in arts-based work, not necessarily at the center of your own academic praxis, but maybe in the future, that's a direction you have been thinking about going. But I just want to say at this moment in time that, that's something I've been moving toward. And given the events that we've experienced over the last couple of years and the heightened events of the last 2 weeks, 3 weeks, it feels more pressing to me than ever that we as academics are inviting students into new ways of showing up, especially at this time of where there aren't clear answers and the anxiety is very, very high.
Thanks, Kim.
One thing I would say about when I was teaching in terms of the anxieties that enter the classroom is that I was really shocked to witness how much the students think of their university as Natalie was saying earlier, a really punitive environment and institution. And I was able to notice that because the ways in which they felt compelled to kind of like unpack all of their trauma to me, all of the ways in which they were experiencing violence very concretely immediately at the moment to like explain why they weren't able to submit a paper or stuff like that. And the ways that they felt forced to kind of like open up and talk to me about very distressing personal things because they were afraid that they were going to be punished otherwise in their evaluations or in the way they were able to learn, really made me realize how much we have to work to help students unlearn this violence that they think the institution is directing towards them. And I think that a lot of people who are teaching should really, and we should all try to enact this work, because we like and I think it's something that is going to become more and more prevalent, that this feeling that the institution is there to kind of get you. And I was really surprised to realize how that's how the students were really perceiving their classroom or their institution as a whole. And that's something that I really had to do to kind of like help them realize that that wasn't what I was there for, and that wasn't what the department or the university was there for, but it was really a deeply ingrained idea. And so I think that when we have to deal with students' anxieties, we have to think through them in relationship with the fact that that's how they think of power in the university, and how they kind of have to contend with it. So that's one thing. And otherwise, in relation to my current research, it's a really difficult question. I mean, you were talking earlier, Natalie, about like teaching about students' resistance, being resistant to do the readings and stuff like that. And that's a thing for sure. But like the things that I'm seeing with those sexuality education teachers right now, it's the kind of resistance that they have to contend with in the classroom is how do I teach sexuality education to like 15-year-old neo-Nazis, literally. And so these kinds of resistances are very, very difficult to deal with. And we don't have a clear answer for now. Like my thesis is mostly about writing how to think through these issues, not solve them just yet. But the idea of resistance and anxiety and violence in the classroom is a very difficult one, because in a way, those who need these teachings the most are also those who are the hardest to reach. And so, yeah, it's kind of an open question. It's difficult to face, but yeah.
Go ahead, Natalie. Yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to add something around the sort of coercive dimension of teaching and education. That I feel like one of the first opportunities that I had to teach was when I was a graduate student. And I was in a French department, and so the first class that I taught was actually a language class. And teaching a language class allowed me to understand and experience just how intimate a process learning is. Like, I think it's much more obvious when you're learning a language, because like you literally have to try to get like your mouth, your tongue, your throat to like be inhabited by this other, language and other identity, and have it be part of you and inhabit your body in a really literal way to make these sounds that you've never made before. And that process just makes it clear how invasive learning is and how intimate it is. And I think that's the case even when we're not learning a language, right? When we're learning a theoretical framework, when we're learning about different histories that are our own, that are not our own, that are, especially when they're challenging. And the university is a space that is often, as we were saying, coercive and punitive, but that's also, extremely ableist, and where I think students aren't really able to be in the classroom in an embodied manner. And I'm, really curious about, what Kim shared around, arts-based education as a way to maybe disarm some of the defenses that almost naturally, I think, come up when people are faced with knowledge that feels challenging. And I think it's something that I've done in some of my classes, but that I would like to do more, because I'm often kind of torn between implementing more coercive measures that would ensure the students would do their readings. But most of the time I err towards not implementing those. And maybe that in itself is like the lesson, right? Maybe that is actually in itself what they learn, is that like it is possible to be in a classroom where you don't have to justify everything that you do or don't do. And you can actually learn at a pace that feels accessible to you and comfortable to you. Or you can, like step out or break down or whatever it is. You can have a body, whatever that might mean. And so yeah, I think that maybe that in itself, beyond the readings, maybe that can also be what the students take away from our classes.
Great. I love this. We have time for, I think, some good Q&A/discussion with the audience. And I don't think you can likely see, if you're on the hybrid version, the room full of people who have joined us tonight. But I just want to thank everybody for coming out today, and for those of you who are online also. And so if you're here in person and you've got a question or a comment, you can raise your hand, and someone from Fourth Space, I think is it Douglas, is going to bring around the microphone. And if you are online, you can type your question in the chat, and someone from Fourth Space will be able to read it out loud for us. And also, we have a To Natalie issue, and so I'll invite those of you who have questions for Nathalie Batraville to just direct them towards Natalie, and you can refer to me as NKT. NKT, my initials.
Everyone does.
Everyone does. It's how I go. It's how I go here at Concordia. That's my name here.
Do we have any questions? Just raise your hand. I'll bring a microphone over to you. Same online. Oh, there's one front.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I have many questions, but I think the one that keeps coming back for me too around pedagogy is also navigating these institutions that are very punitive, sometimes also not just to students, but to educators in different ways. And I'm wondering, maybe Nathalie Batraville, or NKT, but maybe everyone, like this idea of play as something that I think can be a cool counter to a lot of the grief we're feeling, but also maybe this carceral context that we're in. How have you thought about play in terms of evaluation and speaking back to the institution maybe, and the ways you speak to the institutional mechanisms that maybe don't want us to be playing and don't want us to be playing with gender or anything like that, maybe on behalf of your students or maybe with your students, or maybe as students? I guess, yeah, can you speak more about play as a form of pedagogical resistance or something else?
Thank you for that question. I guess the first part of my answer would be that it's already played. That's like part of like my argument in the article, is that like professors are already kind of cosplaying and like a kind of like, socially imposed dom role, and like, except that it's not consensual, right? Like, except that students don't really consent to be the subs in that dynamic, but unfortunately they're asked to come in and follow the rules, and in exchange they get a piece of paper and a line on their CV. But so it's already play, right? Like professors are already playing a role. And that in itself can be also like a form of, one can experience that in different ways, but one can experience that namely as a form of violence, right? Like not wanting to inhabit that role, or not feeling comfortable with the non-consensual dimension of that role. And so for me, the shift is like to try to have it be as collaborative as possible, to have the play be one that allows students to have a say. And so the peer teaching really allows for that, in that, I've had some students like really enjoy or one student at least like really enjoy like dressing up, like dressing up like a professor on the day that they get to teach the class, which all of us, well, not all of us, but many of us do, right? But that kind of lightens things a little bit. And I think there's obviously a balance because, at the end of the day, I still hold an important piece of power in that I'm grading them. But I should also say that I do allow them to grade their own facilitation based on a rubric that I provide. But one of the incentives is that I actually allowed them to evaluate themselves for their play. But yeah, for me, the big piece around play is to try to have as much collaboration. I think it's difficult because the system is so rigid that often when we ask students like what they want, like they're not really used to answering that question. And so often they just like say like, whatever, it's fine. Like whatever you decided is fine. And so I think like trying to build into the structure of the class, like opportunities for students to step up, or not step up, I think is really important, because I think just asking them the first day of class often in my experience isn't enough. But then I'm also really curious about, like, as Kim said, like arts-based opportunities. Like I often have students make zines, and in general, like, whenever I hear students like laughing in class when they're like talking with each other, for me, that's like a sign that like their bodies are hopefully a little bit relaxed. And for me, that is an opportunity that indicates that there is like maybe more learning that can happen because of that slightly more relaxed state. I hope that answers the question, but I'd also be curious to hear if people in the audience have thoughts as well about more play.
I think this is a really excellent question. I think when we look at the history of education and we look at the history of post-secondary education in the larger context of K-12 education, there's a significant history of violence as part of the institutionalization of learning. And some of that is embedded in a coercive structure to try and assimilate and normalize populations into docility. So through the Colonial Project, with the history of the residential school system as part of the settler colonial project, and the role of education to produce, docile worker subjects under the rise of capitalism. And certainly there are all kinds of ways that we see like punitive and carceral structures in education, like the role of policing in education, punitive processes like suspensions and expulsions, which disproportionately target racialized and impoverished students in K-12 education. And this kind of thing impacts students in post-secondary education as well. And especially over the last year, we've seen an increase in a lot of carceral frameworks used by universities and colleges in response to student encampments and political movements, especially those in solidarity with Palestine. And so I think that in that larger context, a lot of our institutions and educational institutions are kind of digging a little deeper in that kind of carceral punitive framework. We're hearing lots about students who are suspended or expelled from school. There's a lot of threat around punishment. People are feeling threatened about losing their jobs, who are working in higher education. And I think really the antidote to this consideration or this concern is really to rethink what we want from our institutions, because these institutions are filled with people. They're filled with our colleagues, people that we may personally know or have relationships with, and some that we don't. And I think that given the larger context that we're facing right now, one of the things that might be helpful to think about is how to reorient our relationship to what we do with institutional power. And I think that this provocation to think about play as resistance is really great. I like this idea a lot, that through play we can kind of resist the way in which pedagogy can be punitive. But I think also play is an invitation to play with the boundaries of things, to reshape and reimagine, to rethink, to reorient our relationships and roles within education. And that's where I see a lot of potential. I think that post-secondary education is a place that really could benefit a lot right now from reimagining the relationship between our educational institutions and those who are part of those institutional spaces, like students and teachers. I think the more that we understand ourselves as collaborators in education, the better served we'll be at being able to withstand and resist the institutional or the larger kind of political structures that might come to punish us from outside of our institutions. And to do that, we really need to think about how we build different kinds of relationships. And so I think, I'm not an expert on the kind of childhood psychoanalytic work on play and childhood in that way, the work of like people like Melanie Klein or Winnicott. But from the scholars who work in the area, one of the things that they point to is that play is incredibly important for that. So thinking about what you could do playfully in an educational setting is really interesting. It doesn't just mean like using games in the classroom, although it might be. And certainly our colleagues in the STEM fields are really good at finding ways of incorporating games into learning. I think that really is a testament to the strengths of those fields that I want to learn more from. But I think also play can mean softening, like softening our desire to control, to impose a model or framework, and to allow more space for exploration and making mistakes and failing. And I think play is one of those spaces where, that children and adults who play are meant to try and, you're meant to make mistakes and you're meant to fail. You're meant to fall and hurt yourself. You're meant to try and pick yourself back up. You're meant to break a toy. Those things are supposed to happen when you play. If you don't play that way, then you're probably playing under the constraints of something punitive, like you're going to get in trouble if you break your toy or something like that. So taking those kinds of lessons, I think, can be really interesting for like thinking about what to do next right now. So I love the idea of maybe getting together with a group of colleagues and just talking about like what we can do to play in our classrooms and what we can do to play with our institutions and to be differently situated in that way. Maybe I'll see if there's some more questions or comments.
Hi, thank you for the talk. It was really interesting, and I guess I wanted to ask about this question around play as well, because I think I'm personally very interested in these kind of strategies in teaching as well, in terms of pushing the boundaries. But oftentimes, as a younger academic, especially those who might be entering the field, applying for jobs, kind of speaking to panels, in my experience, which is actually to do with our fine art teaching, even there is a resistance and lack of openness for early career academics to kind of propose these methodologies. There's still an expectation to kind of teach more traditional, to be more aware and kind of be well-versed in kind of traditional teaching models and curricula, when really we're kind of sitting here and many of us are talking and grappling with questions of decolonization. And sometimes it feels like, especially in art teaching, that the kind of strategies that we are kind of being pushed to teach are actually very colonial and Western. And so it kind of ends up being you having to colonize people or their thinking to then arrive at decolonization, right? So how do we kind of start those processes early, especially when we're thinking about notions of play? How do we challenge the very structure from the foundation of undergraduate or foundation courses, et cetera? I mean, those are the kind of challenges I face personally. So I would be very interested to hear from anyone from the panel their thoughts on this.
Thank you, Abdallah. I mean, I can start us off and just say that, I think considering the coercive and hierarchical structures of our position within institutions has a lot to say about what kind of room we have to maneuver. So certainly tenure affords a particular kind of protection that isn't granted to people who are on the job market or who are starting off in their careers as junior faculty members or who are graduate students. But in those contexts, I would just remind people that there's always room for resistance and using counter methods in in subtle ways. And so even if like you're not presenting your class by completely uprooting the canon of the discipline that you're teaching in, there are ways that you can subtly go about that. And so I would say that like one of the things that I've learned from the people who are on this panel is how much we can learn from one another about creative ways of doing things a little differently. And sometimes something small and subtle might make a substantial change in the way that we approach our own classrooms. And if you find a group of people who collaboratively and collectively agree on changing things, then a lot can actually get changed even within a traditional canonical field or discipline. If you have a critical mass of people who are willing to and engaged and invested in those kinds of changes. But certainly it's the case if you're alone in a room where everyone is in agreement on something that you're fundamentally opposed to, that's probably going to be a little bit more difficult to accomplish in that way. Kim, I think, is that your hand up?
Yeah, I just wanted to say something that occurred to me earlier, and I think is pertinent here, and that is the value of team teaching and thinking through ways that we can be pairing with one another in sort of co-mentoring relationships of teaching practices. I know that at least at Concordia, there's increasing talk about finding ways to reduce barriers to that, and I think it's especially helpful when we're thinking about training PhD students and assistant professors, but also working with our incredibly talented part-time faculty, or adjunct faculty as well. And what how do we dismantle some of those barriers so that we can be doing that work together and problem solving together? Anyway, just a note to say, I feel like that's another piece of when we think about challenging boundaries that are set and somewhat rigid in terms of the institution and how it operates. That's another way I think we can create more openings.
Great, thanks, Natalie.
Mm-hmm. I wanted to echo what you said, and Katie, just around the job market. The job market is its own violence in its own right, its own experience of institutional violence and coercion, such that it would be challenging. But what I would maybe try to say is that there are ways in which one can try to speak the language that is legible to the university, depending on the job that you're applying to. Concordia purports to place an emphasis on like experiential learning. And so like if the institution that you're applying to seems to, favor these measures, then maybe that's a way that you can try to make a case for play. And I think it's unfortunate to have to go through those forms of legitimization. But I actually felt some pressure, not from NKT, but just like when I was writing the article, I had already taught peer facilitation a few times, but like I felt the need to support it with like a bibliography around like why it was pedagogically sound to institute that. And so there was a way in which even in writing this article, I was like, oh my God, like how do I justify this thing that like for me has like these particular benefits that are for the classroom, that are for me. But I suddenly was like, doing research and did find, ultimately I did actually find lots of really great articles that were published that made a case for peer teaching, for peer facilitation. And so it was helpful to like, I felt legitimized by the footnote. And maybe that's part of what you might have to do. But if you do it is possible in some cases to like speak the language of the institution in order to make a case for play and also make a case for the need for those kinds of decolonial interventions, especially in contexts where the university is paying a lot of lip service to those values.
Right. We have time for one more question.
Thank you so much for your talk. And I really enjoyed all your perspective. My question is really a lot about, our institution have become very censored and very, in the sense, they've become very punitive and very biased into professors' opinions, student opinions. So my question to any of you is basically, what is pedagogy in a very censored and punitive institution?
I think that's another really excellent question that we're struggling with institutionally right now at every single college and university, not only in North America, but I think in Europe and other parts of the world right now as well. There's not one answer to that question. It really depends on from what framework or perspective you're coming from. So are you in the role of a student? Are you in the role of a teacher? Do you have tenure? Do you not have tenure? Are you full-time or part-time? Are you in a department in which people are mostly supportive and share a similar view of the classroom or approach to pedagogy, or idea about academic freedom, or a different one? Is your institution the target of a doxing or lawfare campaign, or government and political backlash? So all of those things are going to inform and shape what happens within an institutional setting that might impact how punitive and how censored particular kinds of speech or behavior or engagement happen on campuses. And so it's not, I think it's a question that speaks to the times that we're in right now, and I think it's a really excellent question for that reason. And I really like that you framed the question about this idea of opinions, because we're hearing a lot about opinions, and that's one of the things that was important to me in the framing of this book, that we often think of the topics relating to gender and sexuality, the contributions that we make, to be just about people's opinions. So this is just like a field of opinions. I have a different opinion about whether, there should be inclusive gender pronoun use in our public services or not. This is just what my opinion is, and therefore all opinions are equal and we're all entitled to our opinions. And the reality is that a discipline or a field of scholarship is not just a place of opinions. It's a place of scholarly inquiry into the nature of opinions and the nature of what happens in the world, or different kinds of phenomenon and histories. And so one of the things that I really love about this book is that the book is not itself like a research project. It's not like driven by people's shared research work, but it's informed by the research that they're doing in their fields and in their disciplines, and the way that they approach the classroom through that research perspective. And engagement with scholarly knowledge. I mean, Natalie just spoke directly to this, which is, in writing her chapter, she looked for the scholarly research to justify her use of a pedagogical method, because that's what you do in a discipline, is that you find out what other people have researched and used, and you cite those sources to show evidence that you didn't just make this up because you had an opinion about it. It's rooted in a set of practices that have a legacy, a history, a set of contexts. And certainly the work that we do in education is always in dialogue in some way. And so I think that what's really important is that we give space in education for people to think through their opinions, but that we not end our engagement in scholarly spaces with opinion-based frameworks. That opinions have to be correlated and connected with knowledge, with understanding, with analytic approaches of being able to identify where those frameworks come from, and also with self-reflection. Where did we get that opinion? Where did I get that opinion? I certainly have a lot of opinions that maybe don't really have a place in a basis of knowledge of some kind. Why do I have those? Well, because I've had life experiences, or I've had positions or perspectives that have shaped some of those personal values. But I think that we're in a moment where we've hadn't collapsed this idea about what happens in higher education, or what happens in post-secondary education. Classrooms as places where we should be all exercising opinion freely, and that this is just what it means to exercise academic freedom or free speech. And the reality is that a space that is open to academic freedom and to free expression helps to redirect our relationship to opinions towards scholarly engagement. And that's what I think, to my mind, why I like post-secondary education, because it gives us a set of places and practices in the classroom, through assignments, through scholarly engagement, to really investigate what's happening in those contexts. And I think our institutions, like our universities and colleges, need to be doing more to equip us with the tools and skills to be able to be in the classroom in a way that we feel like we can help support that redirection work. And I think that's something that is really harming us within the educational setting, because instead what we're getting is, okay, well, this is too hard to do, so let's not talk about those things. We shouldn't talk about these topics because they're gonna make people upset, or someone has a lot of feelings attached to this topic, or they have a lot of opinions attached to the topic, therefore we should avoid them. And what I'm suggesting is that we should actually be equipping ourselves. If you're interested in actually talking about these things, let's come together. Let's have a conversation about how to introduce that in our classrooms, rather than just trying to avoid those topics from discussion. And I think that that's an orientation towards education that is inspired and informed by the work of women, gender, sexuality, feminist studies scholarship, which has come out of really pushing back against the status quo of our institutions that have taken for granted how knowledge has been produced in a pretty siloed way historically, and has asked us to think differently about those things. So that's like my kind of teachery way of responding to that question. But we have some other panels who might have some insights and thoughts as well.
Yeah, I appreciated that answer as well. I was thinking about, I mean, I think that what NKT said at the beginning of her response is extremely, extremely important around, like, you know, where we're positioned in the university. Because I think that the current context of repression and censorship is one in which, or of exacerbated repression and censorship is one in which I think it's easy to feel like we don't have power because the university is flexing its power in such clear and oppressive, overwhelming ways, and like making statements, but then also sanctioning students, suspending students, et cetera, removing, you know, permissions to use university spaces. But in a lot of ways, those responses are really a testament to the power that students have, to the power that that faculty have. And so I think part of the thing is to try as much as possible to continue trying to think about what building power looks like, and building relationships, and to try to continue doing that. I'm, you know, a fan of Fred Moten and Stefano Harni's book, the Undercommons, where they talk about, you know, the marginalized people that have always been within the institution, somewhat outside of the institution or on its margins, but still often working together and thinking together. And I think that thinking can sometimes happen in the classroom. Sometimes it can't happen in the classroom because of the nature of that particular classroom. But I try as much as possible, when I have the space to think about crafting a class, to have that class rise as much as possible to like the challenge of a particular moment. And that has been the case in the recent class that I've tried to create around Palestine. I don't know who's unmuted. But yeah, for me, it's been important to try to think about how my classroom can be that space. I used to come from like a religious background. I'm now something of an atheist, but I think that sense of like people congregating together being something really special has stayed with me. And so for me, the act of, you know, 20, 30, 50 people coming together for 12 weeks to think about something together is one that's really powerful and can be kind of revolutionary on a small or big scale. And so I think it's part of the work is like to honor that potential to like actually offer something that that can be generative, can be a generative use of those 12 weeks and that gathering.
Thank you, everybody, so much for coming out tonight. Thank you so much to Kimberly, Natalie, and Alexis for joining us today, and to Ryan and to everyone at Fourth Space. And I'm very honored to be able to celebrate this book and to to be in conversation with you all, and I'm looking forward to continuing the collaborations. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Natalie, Kimberly, Natalie, also Alexis, and everyone for coming in. I'm not going to re-say it. We're going to thank you again.
Thank you. Thank you so
Thank you.
much.
Close things up,
Great
to let
to
you
be
know. We're going to close the
Thank
Zoom and the
you.
live stream now. This remains available on our YouTube channel. You should revisit it. You should also have a good evening. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Bye.